Hey, this is David Wolinsky back with another audio interview from the archives of NoDon'tDie.com. This time I'm bringing to you the first half of my conversation with Mark Cousins. He's a film critic and historian, and we spoke on September 6, 2016. If you'd like to read a full transcript of our conversation, you can check the link below, and also below you'll see a link to my Patreon, where your support helps me continue with the work on this project. Thanks.
Yeah, my full name's Mark Cousins. I'm Irish, but I've been living in Scotland for 30 years. I'm 50 years old. I mostly make documentary feature-length films. I don't work in TV. I'm a director, and I also write books.
Okay, great. So this is a very broad place to start, but what do you feel is the state of storytelling in movies today? Like, what's exciting? What do you feel is getting played out? Is there stuff going on today that you wish that you could have, amended onto the end of the story of film that we are experiencing today?
Yes, there are lots of good films being made around the world. People are quite pessimistic about what's happening in contemporary cinema, but that's because they're looking in the wrong places. If they look in Philippines, for example, or Romania or Iran, they'll see great stuff. I'm very interested in, you say, state of storytelling, because I think that the medium of film has got a interesting, complicated relationship with storytelling in general. Some of the more famous movie genres, like the thriller, are full of high story content. It's like they've had story distilled into them. But other movie genres, if you think of like sticking with American films, or the westerns of John Ford, some of them don't have much story at all. They're more about place, atmosphere, and the story is just it's down amongst the other elements in the film, and that's the kind of stuff I like. I like the films that have been de-dramatized somewhat, where the story doesn't bully you and it's just one amongst other elements. It's like the kind of, it's like the kind of kettle drums or the bow fiddle or something, but not the conductor.
Yeah. So you mentioned, people are rather pessimistic about the state of movies. Are you talking about people who are saying that this is we're experiencing a new golden age of TV? Or are you talking about people who say that and TV is better than film now?
I wasn't thinking in terms of TV. There's so much talk, I'm sure, in your country, here in my country as well, about how TV has some way usurped cinema as the long-form storytelling medium. I still see them as very distinct things, and so I've never really got myself into that discussion. I think I'm more talking about, there are a group of kind of older people who are cinema nostalgists, and they think that the golden age of movies was in the 1960s, for example, or some people would say earlier or later. But I've never really bought that. I think that if you're looking at Anglo cinema in the English language, you maybe sometimes have a disappointing time. But if you look elsewhere, there's innovation happening all the time. And I think that's one of the key things for me when I look at an art form, that what makes it crackle or bubble or excite is its innovation.
Well, you mentioned interesting things happening in Iran and Philippines. What? I mean, that's rather broad, but what is it that's more interesting to you than Anglo cinema?
Well, what's happening in both those countries is that word I used a few minutes ago, de-dramatized. The best of the filmmakers in those countries are understanding that story is a kind of delivers human pleasure. It's a kind of engine that drives you through an artwork, especially a time-based artwork. But if it's the only element or the primary element in the artwork, then it feels like the purpose is just to get your pulse racing or drive you through or stop being bored. And art of course has got bigger fish to fry than that, as it were. And these filmmakers are using elements of story, but they're also they're often coming from a tradition of poetry rather than prose, for example, and they're very interested in things like, the poetics of the city, how a city works, the excitement of wandering and drifting through a place, the sort of thing that way back in the early 20th century Virginia Woolf was writing about. I always say she's one of the great filmmakers, even though she didn't make a film, and I would argue that she's I don't know, the patron saint of gaming in some way as well, you know, because these early modernists in the 1910s and 1920s were coming up with so many brilliant ideas about how minds drift, consciousness drifts, etc., which were so vivid and so alive, and the sort of films are being made in Philippines by this guy Lav Diaz, and then Iran by loads of filmmakers, they're giving us the pleasure of narrative, but they're giving us the pleasure of non-narrative, and I want both.
So, I mean, this is a sort of mundane follow-up question, but I mean, what just to state it for the purposes of this project, I mean, what is your awareness and perception of, you know, video games today in the video game industry? Like, when I say those words, what does that conjure up to you? I think you said in our emails, like, you're only aware of Minecraft.
No, Minecraft's the only one I've played. I've got a nephew who plays lots of games, and every single film festival you go to now has got its VR suite, for example, and so I've done a fair bit of VR, but no, I haven't really played any games properly. You know, of course, I'm aware, as everybody is, of people walking around sort of bumping into things because of Pokemon Go and stuff like that, but really, no, I know almost nothing. But I know, I guess what I'm interested in is the kind of, when I watch my nephew playing the way time seems to disappear for him, and I think that lots of great art, that's what it tries to do. It tries to take you out of your own time zone and put you into another one, or I suppose you could say a space zone. So I love watching him do that.
So, I mean, how do you feel interactivity changes a narrative? Like you know, like because video games have stories in them, movies have stories in them. But how do you feel that quality changes the story or the approach of storytelling?
I would say it sort of harmonizes with story in a way. It's one of the elements. Say, for instance, when I walk through this city where I'm now living. After this interview, I'm going to meet a friend for a steak. I will walk through the city and make a series of choices when I come to street corners. Do I go that way or that way for a change? So I'm being interactive with my own city, and I love that, you know, that kind of drifting-y thing that they used to write about a lot in France in the 60s. I think that is something that human beings have always done, especially in built places. And they've done that long before games came along. And I think games have kind of understood the pleasure of that, or the kind of joy of once you realize you've made a decision, then that has implications for the next street corner, as it were, you know. But in terms of, for me, I'm going to say something about cinema here. I want to be done to, as it were, you know. I want to have an artistic experience where I say to someone, okay, I give you 2 hours of my time or more, whatever it is, do something. Take me somewhere. I relinquish control. I take my hands off the wheel. You know, you take control. You drive me somewhere interesting. And so that's very kind of, you could say that's old school cinema. That's one of the great pleasures of cinema for me. And I think that's, I suspect, I don't know, you would know, but I suspect that that's not a pleasure that you can have as much or at all when you're playing a video game.
I mean, no, to the extent, I mean, I'm sure, have you heard of Call of Duty, for example?
I've heard of it, but I don't know anything about it. Yeah,
so I interviewed a writer who wrote, you know, the story for that game, and he talks about how there's a great pressure to keep things going. So even when there is story, it doesn't take you out of the game because it's upsetting or it's jarring or it's frustrating for people that they, you know, quote unquote, have to pay attention to the story and they can't be playing. But I mean, the bigger question I'm sort of asking you and exploring here is, you know, what can games sort of learn to meaningfully grow as a culture and industry, to sort of assimilate better? I know you said, you know, you don't know much about games, so I mean, maybe if we're using movies as a template, this might sound a little silly, but, you know, what can someone maybe running a sports team learn from the movie industry as far as like a way to better run their business or to better do what they do?
I'll tell you the first thing that comes to mind. I don't think I'll have a very good answer here, but I'll give it a go. The first thing that comes to mind is the fact for the longest time, the movies were made by white men, and they targeted to young white men, and then that became very clear that was unacceptable because the majority of the population of the planet were being ignored. I would suspect strongly that the gaming world has got a similar skew towards white men or younger white men, and I think surely it can learn from that. And I don't know, but I would be very, very surprised if there wasn't a lot of pressure within and without the gaming world to try and broaden its demographic and its diversity, and because once you do that, you get new types of storytellers, new types of emotions, thematics, etc. And I think that's one thing that I've been passionate about in the film world, and my thing, the story of film, has been part of that push to say, come on guys, let go a bit and let other people get control, because you know what, it'll actually be more fun and more mysterious, and there'll be new types of stories and new types of encounters and interpersonal relationships if we stop trying to control this ourselves. So that's the first thing that comes to mind.
No, that's actually spot on. There's a great deal of turbulence in video game culture. There has been last few years. I mean, it's sort of obviously been in a quiet boil, and then it finally boiled over. Can you talk a little bit about, as there were pushbacks or attempts to redistribute that ability to tell stories in movies, like how was that received?
The complicated situation there, David, is that in fact there were other people telling stories, so it wasn't a question totally of production, more of distribution. So, for example, the whole of West Africa has been making great films for 50 years, but they were being seen almost nowhere and shown almost nowhere. So the blockage wasn't taking place, or you could even call the censorship, or what I would call the racism by omission, wasn't taking place at the point of production. It was taking place somewhere slightly along the food chain at the point of distribution, and so that's where it became more complicated, because the people who were controlling the industry couldn't say, "Hey, look," they couldn't say, "We're blocking this stuff." They could say, it's all being made, but where the market was failing, as it were, was in the fact that they weren't making it available or sharing it or benefiting from its insights. And so that's the complication in the film world. I don't know if that applies to games too, but beyond that, in the UK, for example, there's been a degree of turbulence, to use your nice word, for example, with the publicly funded film. There are far more women and people of colour being given money to make films here than there have been in a very long time, and it's been an explicit push. That means, of course, that people like me, white guys, middle-aged white guys, and looking at your picture, I think you fit into this category as well.
I'm not middle-aged yet, but yeah.
I didn't mean
I'll see you at the next meeting, yes.
Then we have had to actually step back, and I presume there's been a proportionate loss in income and employment from the kind of dominant white men, and that has created rancor among people, and usually not publicly spoken. People are very, very reluctant to speak out in public and say, the white guys need to hold on to their power. But behind the scene, there's a lot of fury and resentment. Or no, fury is too wrong. Resentment that funding is being proportionally allocated to minorities.
To make the quote-unquote wrong type of movies. Is this people in the audience, or is this manifesting itself online?
Filmmakers.
Filmmakers. Oh wow.
Filmmakers. The people who have the power, who have the means.
So they feel that they're getting fewer opportunities.
Yeah. But also, as we know the way capitalism works, it'll pounce on any opportunity to make more money. And one of the big things, if we forget about gender and colour for a minute and look at age, for the longest time, older audiences were ignored by mainstream cinema, particularly Hollywood. But then there were a number of big box office hits starring older actors and actresses, and suddenly people realized there's this vast untapped market, and so there was very little turbulence there once the filmmakers realized we could make films about people in their 60s on their second or third relationships or in retirement, and they get entertained and we get loads of money, and it was a win-win proposition. So that was painless transition. It's an ongoing process, but that was painless.
Well, you make a very good and interesting point in the story of film, where you mentioned that I don't want to only fixate on America, but you mentioned that Jewishness was not center to American movies, although there were so many Jewish people working around.
Especially
movies.
in the first 20 years, yeah.
Which is a really fascinating thing to articulate, because I think people don't realize that's true until they hear that said.
Yeah.
So what do you think makes those tipping points occur where those types of stories are able to be told, even if they already are, like you said, dominantly in that area? I mean, what sort of needs to shift or change for those voices to be heard, or for those stories to get equal play? If not, I guess you're saying it sounds like we can't really do equal. It's sort of we take turns.
Yeah. I think it's underlying social change. This civil rights movement in the 60s and the kind of fragmentation of the kind of Eisenhower consensus in the 50s meant that cinema, Hollywood hadn't a notional every person out there, a sort of nuclear family kind of person. They realized that people wanted to consume entertainment in a more culturally specific way, according to their own cultures or musical tastes, etc. And because the US is such a big country, if you decide to make films that have got more the Jewishness at the cultural center of them, you'll realize there are a lot of people there who will buy a ticket for that stuff. So it was more the kind of breakdown of consensus in the 50s coming into 60s, that fragmentation that happened for all sorts of reasons, as we know, in terms of war and political movements and liberation movements, etc. But that meant that Hollywood became braver in its ability to manifest cultural difference. They were in the 40s, they made great cinema, but it was always cinema in disguise. It was always like a masquerade, almost like a drag act, where they were pretending that there was this every person, and they were speaking a kind of bland language as a result of that, I would say. So they just had to get the courage. And, of course, minorities had to get their own cultural confidence as well. But as we know, the Jewishness thing is fascinating, because you think the greatest entertainer, I think, in American cinema wasn't born American, but it was Ernst Lubitsch, who made these incredibly Jewish films. And then Billy Wilder comes along and surfs that wave. And yet it didn't, in some way, it didn't really become a movement until Woody Allen comes along and people like that.
It's funny. I mean, I guess this is another broad one. I don't know if you have a sense of this. I know you also do mention this in story of film, but what influence do you feel video games have had on cinema?
Yeah, quite a lot, I'd say.
Was it most noticeable starting with Gus Van Sant, like you said in your movie, or did you notice in your research maybe even before that as well?
No, it was particularly with Jerry that I really noticed it. That walking cinema, which I think Van Sant is he's a great magpie. He's a great artist in his own way, but he's great at picking up on things. And I think the Jerry film, have you seen it?
I have, yeah.
I think that it's, he told me that it very explicitly related to the kind of the walker in the walker avatar figure in video
Tomb Raider.
Yeah, in Tomb Raider, yeah. And I think that not many other people in the creative end of cinema were trying to ask what's interesting about this. The walker, that kind of basically Tomb Raider is a kind of John Wayne, I would say. You know, walking out into Monument Valley, etc. You know, and actually I have played Tomb Raider. I forgot about that. But it's that sense of the cinema is great at solitude, the solo figure in the landscape, whether it's John Wayne or whether it's Jack Lemmon in The Apartment. Cinema's particularly good at that, and I think my guess is that video games like that. You know, the appeal to the player is that you inhabit, you're at the center of this world, and everywhere you look, the world moves around you. Of course, you can hook up with other people in that world, I guess, but it's that kind of, you are the center of the universe, and if you walk to get to a place. That's a very cinematic proposition. I would almost turn your question on its head and say, you know, what did games get from cinema? But then
I was going to ask you that next, but I wasn't sure if you could speak to that. Yeah,
sorry, and that's because I was waffling. I got there in a waffly way.
It's okay.
But then I would say, of course, the kind of brittle look of digital cinema, the digitizing of the film process has meant that there are an awful lot of very big budget films that have got they have sort of severed their connection with reality, their sort of existential thing with the real world, that they don't try to feel real world. Whereas often my impression is that video games are trying to look hyper real, more and more real, whereas cinema is almost going the other direction, because cinema can do realness effortlessly. You just point your camera outside the window and you've got reality. And so cinema is trying to augment that in some ways, or do the thing it can't do.
Interesting. Well, video games, yeah, I mean, I'm sure you've heard of the uncanny valley, right?
Yes, of course, absolutely.
I mean, I'd be curious to hear, to your eye, when you see video games that look that way. I mean, I almost feel like it's so straining on the eye to see that much in hyper, sort of like an affected hyper real with no depth of field, just everything all the time in pure focus. So I mean, I guess I'm sort of tipping my hand, telling you what I think. But to your eye, what do you think when you do see games that are right up against that valley? I think
that's a great phrase. I don't remember when I heard it, but I probably heard it late. But I think it's a great phrase because it points out that 0.1% that hasn't been achieved in the image or in the visual. So it's got 99.9%, but that 1% makes it a miss as good as a mile. You know, I think of I think of Roland Barthes' great book on where he's talking about photography, and he has this phrase, the punctum. Do you know that phrase?
I do, yeah.
And what you know what he's talking about there. Then he's talking about that unintended, often happen chance or accidental thing, and usually an old Victorian photograph, which that the photographer and the sitter and everybody who made the picture did not intend to be there. It might be a dog, or it might be a passerby, or it might be a sort of a stray eyeline or something. Those kind of unpredictable things that make the real, and that's what the uncanny valley doesn't have. That kind of like unpredictable punctum, that thing that suddenly the reality snares you like a fish hook.
Right.
And I think that's what he means by punctum, and it pricks you, or that fish hook thing. And I think that's, you can strain and make such an effort to create something hyper real, and yet you just miss something of the unconscious, you could say. And so if you start with the visual, then you're just going to miss a sense of place or reality, I think. But if you start with the unconscious, then you're going to get there a lot quicker.
Do you feel video games have impacted the spaces in which stories are able to be told in, whether you see it ripple to movies or elsewhere?
I would say that I wouldn't say affected exactly, but I would say that there are certain buildings that you walk through now that feel as if you're walking through a video game. I think there's a close relationship between architects love all that stuff. I'm sure you've talked to lots of architects about this, but that idea that how a building narrates and how a building tells you how to walk through it and tells a story, etc. I think there's a close relationship between how video games work and how architects work, and especially those people who write about the poetics of space, like Bachelard. I'm sure you know his book and whatever it's called. I can't remember, Poetics of Space or something. And those people who are talking about the pleasure of walking into a space, getting lost in the space, not losing your bearings, and then realizing you're on your own, and it's up to you how to decide where to move to next, which room, or should you corner down in a room and have a breathing space before you head on into the next bit of the unknown maze of the building. I think that you could say a lot of that about a video game as well, I guess, So I don't know that I would say, I don't know enough of it to say that games have affected that kind of thing, but it's exactly the same thought processes, I think, that architects sometimes have.
Well, in video games, I think it's waning now, but for the longest time there was a persistent obsession with could this be the quote-unquote Citizen Kane of video games?
Oh, yes.
I don't know if have you heard this before?
I've heard people talking about that before, yeah.
Well, I mean, broadly, just my question is, I'm curious to hear what would make you think people outside of a medium would be fixated on that movie specifically, because to my mind, at least, it's not as though Citizen Kane made movies, quote unquote, legitimate, right?
No, it didn't. What Citizen Kane did was it was a great encyclopedia. It was the most fantastic summary of everything cinema had achieved until that point. And that it was like having a tasting menu, and that's why, people went wow, because they thought, God, look at all these flavors. It can do all this stuff. That's why it feels, even today, I watched it recently, Citizen Kane feels even now a very kind of fragmented, bitty experience, because you jump between styles and moods and emotions and themes and all sorts of stuff. It also, by the way, feels very much about Donald Trump when you watch it.
Yes, that's true.
But
don't hold that against me, please. Yeah.
So when people say something in another art form is the Citizen Kane of that art form, what I think they're usually trying to say is, here it's a kind of state of the nation. This is a kind of summary of how far we have got. All the dazzling techniques all in one text. So I think that's what usually it means.
Other than video games, what have you heard that's like Citizen Kane of buffets?
Opera, buildings, music.
Really?
Yeah, it seems to be one of those things. Because cinema is such a new art form, and so still it's very, very young, and so Citizen Kane came along about 50 years or less after cinema had been developed, and so it was like, you can't really say that about a novel particularly, because novels are so old, but it was early in the history, the evolution of cinema, and people were asking, what is cinema? What is it good at doing? And here, Orson Welles answered us in 100-minute movie. Here's what it's good at doing. All this stuff, space, pathos, hubris, sound, everything.
How often do you feel people who make that comparison have actually seen Citizen Kane?
Funny, when I was in Traverse City, Michigan recently, and we put it on and asked the audience how many had seen it, and I would say 90% hadn't.
That's kind of what I figured.
Yeah.
Well, so another parallel too is, you mentioned in Story of Film, you talk about John Woo coming to America and starting to direct Jean-Claude Van Damme, which is a very good parallel for video games coming to the West and them sort of being taken over by the Jean-Claude Van Damme sort of oeuvre.
Yeah.
But I'm curious, how do you think that Eastern sensibilities had to conform to Western audiences, and to complete that circuit, what impact did those movies being made in the West make back in the East?
Yeah, I think that's a very important question. Eastern sensibilities, I'm sure of course you know this, but in Eastern aesthetics and Eastern culture, there's a different balance between movement and stasis, between action and inaction. You can see it across all the art forms, in theatre, even in very popular cinema, everywhere. And often there'll be a burst of action, and then a pause, and it's like, you know, it's Buddhist aesthetics, all that. In Hollywood, the pause, the inaction, has had less of a role, less of a life. And so when the great Eastern directors came west, they gave more shape or contour, I would say, to action cinema, because they were very good at knowing when to make things really kinetic and then pausing everything almost to a stop. However, the reverse, as you imply, is also, alas, true. There's a new type of of Chinese cinema at the moment, the big film, as they call it, which is aping Hollywood. I think it's called Dapien in Mandarin or something. And here they are they're having a more Hollywood approach to action, which is basically non-stop. It's that old thing. Let's start with an earthquake and build up to a climax, you know, that which always makes me laugh. And I think that actually, you know, it has a bluster and a kind of energy and excitement to it, but actually it's exhausting over a whole film or over a whole series of films or over a whole generation of films. And I think already, I don't know if there's any evidence for this, but I suspect the Chinese audiences are already finding this new type of non-stop action Hollywood-style Chinese film and culturally foreign in some way. You know, it's quite exciting to show up to, and it's what is this thing, but it doesn't really quite fit Asian sensibilities. So I would hope that would settle down, and that we can, one of the big themes in the story of film is that we can each learn from each other's cinema, because there's so much great in Hollywood and so much great in Asian cinema. And I think what you want is the best of both, and that's why the great figures who move between, you know, like John Woo and John Woo and the others, you know, they are the envoys. They are traveling the Silk Road of cinema and bringing, you know, the great spices from the East and the great mercantile products from the West. And so I love that exchange. And I would assume and hope that you can get the same mutual enrichment in the video game world.